Hey everyone, it's Shaylin, and I'm here today with another writing video. Today I'm going to be talking about creating complex characters. Character is arguably, probably from many people's point of view, including my own, the most important element of story. Without good characters, I don't think you're really going to have a strong novel. Hope that hot take isn't too spicy for the day, but I have kind of just a random hodgepodge of notes that I have literally taken over the past years on this topic and not made the video. Literally some of these points I jotted down when I was in second year of university. I'm in fourth year now, so I've literally had this video in the works for so long. Like all of my videos, this one's gonna start with a disclaimer. I think it's important to know that this isn't really a checklist. When you're creating a character, you're creating a person, and what you have to do is sell to the audience that this is not only a real person, but a person interesting enough for them to spend 8 hours of their life following. And to do that requires a certain amount of empathy and just understanding of the character that goes beyond any specific technique or specific point. This is gonna sound kind of like floofy and airy, but like understanding your character's soul. Understanding their essence as a person and kind of being able to feel that. I don't know how to teach that. It's probably basically everyone who writes, who's watching this is like, I hear ya, I gotcha. I don't really know how to explain that, but I really think that the most important part of writing a character is that your character has the spark of life to them and that translates onto the page. I'm gonna talk today in this video about some ways to make your characters more complex, some strategies you can use, some techniques to use. This isn't to say that this is necessarily a checklist, you just tick all these boxes. For my personal process, I don't consciously really think of all these things, you know? Most of the time my characters kind of just start to appear and I kind of start to get a grasp of who they are, and it's kind of like a, you know, Vulcan mind meld, and you have access to who they are as a person. I think this is probably a pretty common experience I'm describing. So I don't necessarily sit down and checklist all of these things, but these are some things to consider if you feel like your character maybe needs a little more pizzazz. Even if you don't apply it consciously, the better your understanding of the principles are, the more it will start to appear just in your like natural, you know, your natural understanding of the character. It kind of just like strengthens your writer's intuition. So the first note that I wrote was complex psychology. This is something that I had a writing professor who would always write on people's stories, like needs more complex psychology. And I think a lot of the time when characters fall flat, it's because their psychology isn't complex enough. Read too simply. And a character whose psychology reads too simply feels kind of robotic because people don't read simply. People don't read like kind of just like, you know, boom, 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 and it's all perfectly logical. Like that's just not how people think or feel, and it's just a good thing to keep in mind is complicate the psychology. But now I'm going to get into kind of like some ways to do that. The next point I wrote down was goals and desires. This is standard writing 101. Goals and desires are kind of the basic way that your character interacts with the plot. Character without desire, without goal, or the way that we always say in my workshops is yearning, like what does the character yearn for? A character without yearning isn't really earning themselves a place as protagonist, and I think that's an important thing to think of as with your characters is, are they earning a place in the story right now? Without a goal, especially for your protagonist, they're not earning a place in the story without a desire of some sort. Plot and character really intersect at that yearning, right? So without that, your character isn't really an active participant in the plot to the extent that we really need them to be. With goals and desires, this is a great place where you can look at psychology more complexly. Your character can have an external goal, but underneath that can have subtextual reasons for that goal, and that's where things can get really complicated. That's where your psychology can get really, really interesting. The reason why someone does something is much more interesting than just the thing they do. This is a great thing to keep in mind when writing anti-heroes. We might not be able to sympathize with the person's actions, but we might be able to sympathize with their reasons for those actions. Or the actions themselves might not be that weird or problematic. There are kind of reasons behind that, and a lot of that might be subtextual, is what makes them interesting and is what makes them complicated. So the next thing I wanted to talk about is something that I learned. I totally forgot about this term, honestly. I found it in my notes, which proved to me how old these notes are. because I learned about this at the beginning of my second year screenwriting workshop. So I don't know if this is a particular screenwriting term, it might be an acting term, but I thought it was kind of interesting, so I thought I'd touch on it, and it's mask and countermask. Mask is kind of the face your character typically shows the world. It can kind of usually be summed up by this one key trait that really exemplifies how they show themselves to other people. But then they also have a countermask, and the countermask is kind of the opposite, or like the inverse of that trait, and it's just as much them. It's not, you know, like a secret dark side or a true color. It's equally them as is the mask, but they really only show it in moments of true vulnerability or when really pushed to show it. Thinking about the protagonist of the book I'm writing right now, her mask is that she's very aloof and detached, makes a point of very actively stating how little she cares about people and how little things, other people's emotions mean to her. But her countermask, which really only shows itself in moments of desperation, is actually kind of a selflessness. A lot of the time with kind of anti-hero type characters, the countermask is actually a more positive side of them, like with my protagonist right now. But a lot of the time with more hero type characters, the countermask is more of a dark side. Now this might seem like a contradiction, but I firmly believe that contradictions are what make characters most interesting, because people are full of contradictions. What you need to find are logical contradictions, or contradictions that make sense, and that's okay. A contradiction doesn't have to be illogical because pretty much every person has a contradiction. Think about yourself. Remember, this was a rule that my screenwriting professor, same one who taught us about mask and countermask, said, was that as a baseline rule, your main character should be at least as interesting as you. Use yourself. You're the person you understand most complexly, probably. Use yourself as the baseline and aim for higher, because I'm not the protagonist of a book for a reason. My main character is, because she's earning that place. So I think contradictions are really important, and I think contradictions are kind of what make a character interesting, and you can really think of yourself and look at your own contradictions. So like when I'm thinking of myself, mine aren't going to be that interesting or weird probably. A contradiction that exists within me is that I'm very much of a pushover, really bend easily under the will of other humans. In some ways I hold myself to like a really strong moral code of things I live by, but then at the same time I sacrifice my own opinions and values so easily for other people in a lot of situations. So it's kind of a contradiction that exists within me, not to just like psychoanalyze myself like this got a little too much. I'm so sorry. It's like think of your own like messed up shit and all the contradictions that exist within you, because basically everyone has them and your character can have them too. Next, this one's actually a little easier to implement, and because it's a bit more surface level and a bit more concrete, it's one I really like to look at when I feel like a character isn't interesting enough, because I feel like it's a bit of a lens for more complicated stuff, and it's just quite simply their interests, skills, hobbies, and line of work. You know, these are really like clear, obvious things. They're kind of things you would fill out in like a character profile if you're into doing those. They make really good windows for more complicated things. Very rarely will you meet a person in life who's not passionate about something, even if it's weird and niche. Like I'm thinking of my family right now. Like my brother is super passionate about chess and he's super passionate about economics. I have a cousin who's just super passionate about birds. Like she just loves birds. And obviously like I'm super passionate about writing. And I think characters without a passion can sometimes almost feel like they're missing the spark of life in them, because most people are passionate about something. These things can tell us so much concretely about a character that it gives the reader room to infer about them. The things they do in their spare time, the hobbies they, you know, dedicate their time to, the skills that they have, and the line of work that they've either ended up in or have chosen to pursue. It's a really good window to their psychology and their kind of vibe and feel as a character. These things can also be used as plot devices if your character has a specific skill that should come up and can be a good way to intersect character and plot. So next up is one that I think is very important, and it's revealing action and detail. So revealing action and detail are basically, so if there's something small that they do that's unexpected, ideally, or something about them that's unexpected, that reveals kind of their colors. So I'm going to use an example, and this is an example from, this is so random, my current writing professor. I remember him teaching us about revealing detail as when he like guest spoke in my first year writing class, and that's where I remember him talking about revealing detail, and I guess I just like wrote it down and now I'm remembering it now. And I don't remember what book he was referring to, but this is a real example. But he said that there was some book where the main character, who's like quite poor and doesn't have a lot of money, and he basically has not a dollar to his name. Or maybe this isn't from a real book and he just made this up. I don't know. Anyways, this is the example I'm using because it's the one that's coming to my mind. He ends up like somehow acquiring a very small sum of money, and instead of going to like buy food or something, he goes and buys himself a set of paints. And that's a revealing detail. It shows what he's passionate about and what he values, that he requires artwork. That's something so integral to his character. So that's a really good example of a revealing action. And similarly, you can have revealing details, which is just like not something the character does, but is kind of always existing within them. Especially near the beginning of your book, but honestly all the way throughout, we should constantly be thinking of revealing action, because we should constantly be learning more about our characters. Every kind of unexpected thing that they do, every time they're active, which they should be continually active, that should be a window to who they are. Next up, now to steal another term from my writing professor, which this is one that like I don't even know if he made this term up, or if it's like a common thing, but I've only ever heard from him, and it's artful incongruity. Any of my friends who are watching this are gonna be like, they know exactly who told us about artful incongruity, and it's so legendary because we just had this one professor who like he would never stop talking about artful incongruity. He was like obsessed with artful incongruity, but I understand why, because I think it's a good thing to talk about. This comes back to what I was saying about contradictions. Artful incongruity, it's exactly what it sounds like. It's incongruous in a way that is artful. Okay, like I went to go explain it and then I literally just restated the words. Basically, this is a way of taking a character type, a character that's maybe a little familiar or can be kind of typified or put into a box, and bringing them out of that. So if you have a character who, let me think of an example. So let's say you have a character who's like he's like a carpenter, he works in trades, he's maybe a bit of a loner. That would kind of be, at this point we're kind of typifying him. Even if he's complex and written complexly, we're still kind of typifying him. So how can we make him more complex? Give him a little artistic contradiction, make it more interesting, kind of a revealing detail. Maybe this character has a really specific interest. I don't know, Renaissance art. Maybe he's been like saving up his money from his like really low paying job that he has so that he can go like to Italy to go to some art museum. I don't know, I'm just making this up off the top of my head. You get the idea, but like make it better than that. Every time I do an example in a video, it's like so bad because I don't plan my examples. I'm such garbage. The way that we were taught to do artful incongruity that I think is good to keep in mind is you have a character, so maybe a character type, and then you think of something that completely contradicts that type. But a lot of the time, if you go for a complete contradiction, it's actually kind of obvious or cliche in itself because it's the first thing we would think of. So you kind of have to scale back just a little so that the contradiction in itself is also interesting and not obvious. Next up is internal world. Internal world, I think, is really important, especially if you're writing a character in first person. You can really, really play with internal world. Internal world is exactly what it sounds like. It's the character's existence within their own mind. And this includes how they interpret situations and people, their imagination, how their unique internal world is going to color the world. An example of this, one of my favorite books, History of Wolves. I never stop talking about this book. The reason I think this book is so good and why I love it so much is because the main character, Linda, has a really, really interesting internal world. Basically, the entire plot line is colored so specifically by her really dark, twisted, messed up internal world, but it's very specific. It makes for a really interesting plot. Like, the plot here is basically rooted in her internal world. And how she's interpreting events. But because her internal world is so specific and so interesting, it makes her one of my favorite point of views I've ever been in. I think we can all recognize that as people, we have rich internal worlds, so don't deprive your character of that. Give your character a rich internal world. You know, this is gonna include like how they perceive and interpret events, what they think about, how they theorize about other people, the assumptions they make, and this can be very, very flawed. This is a really great place to look for flaw and to make your character more interesting through interesting flaws, because every person's worldview and internal world are going to be a little flawed, and you can really do interesting things with flaws through this element. Next up, let's talk about my favorite thing ever with writing, and that's specificity. I love specificity. I never stop talking about specificity. It's my bread and butter. Wait, I'm a vegan. It's my bread and earth balance. Specificity is the shit. I would go as far to say that specificity is the key to good writing. Maybe that's like drastic hot take, but like I would defend that. So I think that a character who's non-specific is going to be one we don't really care about because they are not a specific human being. When you're thinking specificity, be as specific as you can, you know? Like if you say, oh, my character, what do? They're an engineer. That's not that specific. What type of engineering, what specific job sites do they work on, what specifically is their work? You know, there are a lot of different ways that you can show specificity through concrete details that will then again help to create the character's soul, as I'm calling it. Whether you believe in souls or not, it's the term I'm using for the sake of this video. Be specific with their career, but also be specific with their appearance. I think appearance is one that I don't like to overlook. I have a video on writing character descriptions and I'll leave a link to that, but being specific with your character's appearance, instead of just being like, here's my character, she has brown eyes and blonde hair. Like, I don't know, that's not that much. Give us something interesting. Say that she has like a notch scar in one eyebrow. Something interesting, I don't know. But be specific, just to create that stronger image in the reader's mind. Be specific with their hobbies, like I talked about earlier. Be specific with the objects they own and the clothes that they wear and the space that they inhabit. Be specific with their habits and their idiosyncrasies. And the way that I wrote this down in my notes, and it's not phrasing that I think I would use, which means that I definitely stole it from a professor, was make the details unexpectedly congruous. Great specificity doesn't do much if it's obvious, so with your specificity, try to be a little incongruous, but in a way that makes sense. Does that make sense? It makes sense to me. I don't know if I'm articulating it well, but it's kind of like what I talked about a little earlier with Artful incongruity. That little incongruousness that still kind of actually makes sense once you see it. It's hard to do. If I could come up with a brilliant example, I would do it right now. Next up, let's talk about belief system. Belief system kind of ties into internal world, but belief system can be a really key part of your character's arc. So belief system is exactly what it sounds like. It's the belief system. All of these are just exactly what they sound like. Belief system is, you know, the set of beliefs that your character holds about the world, and this is often colored by their backstory. You know, some people say that every aspect of your character has to be justified by backstory. I don't really believe in that. I think some parts of people are kind of inherent, or, you know, they are influenced by backstory, but maybe too subtly for us to trace to like a single event. But this is a great one to tie into backstory if you really like to work with backstory as a writer. I think backstory is really important as well. I just don't believe that like every single aspect of your character has to be justified by their past. I think that's a little extreme. But belief system. So this is, you know, the set of beliefs that they hold about the world, and a lot of the time their beliefs are flawed. Their beliefs are the thing that's going to continually get them hurt throughout the story. And a lot of the time your character's arc or your character's change finds itself in the character being hurt by this belief system, and then eventually realizing their belief system is flawed and then changing. That would be more of a hero's journey, a book where like the character change isn't necessarily positive, which it doesn't have to be. You might see a character whose belief system is negatively colored, is already maladaptive, but then continues to be maladaptive in maybe a different way. But basically the key with belief system is it's what the character believes about the world and how the world works. You can challenge it with the plot. The plot and the belief system should really butt heads, and that's a really good vehicle to push the character into change. Next one I wanted to talk about is self-awareness and self-perception. It's kind of, again, could be part of your character's internal world, but just to touch on it a little more specifically. I think typically a character almost has to be more self-aware than the average person because they have to be able to articulate themselves in a relatively nuanced way on the page. However, your character's kind of gaps in self-awareness or self-perception can be really, really interesting points to explore them. It's something I'm really enjoying exploring with the protagonist of my current work right now, because in some ways she's really self-aware, but in other ways she has really, really inaccurate self-perception, and she almost villainizes herself in her mind. She kind of believes things about herself more negatively than are true. Like there's one part in the book where she straight up says that she has a god complex, which she doesn't actually, but the fact that she believes that about herself when it's not true is, you know, kind of a revealing detail. And it shows kind of a blip in her self-awareness and how she perceives herself. If there's a point where the reader can catch a little discrepancy where the character doesn't perceive themselves perfectly accurately, that can be a really interesting flaw. So then the last thing I wanted to talk about was the dark room. We love the dark room. A lot of these are really specific terms that I use a lot in my writing classes, and I think different people probably have different language for this and different terms that they use, but these are just the terms I was taught a lot of the time. So the term comes from an Alice Munro essay. So let's get a little pretentious and can-litty here, okay? So basically Alice Munro wrote this essay. If I can find an online link to it, I will leave it in the description. Her idea, and this was kind of a way of looking at theme, but we're gonna use it as a way to look at character because theme is kind of rooted in character. A story, and she was talking about a short story, but this applies to a novel, is a house. And what you're gonna do is you're gonna bring the reader into the house and you're gonna guide them through every single room and you're gonna show them every single room. And then eventually you're gonna leave the house. There's gonna be one room in the house that you never show them, and that room is the dark room. Inside the dark room, it holds the key to what the story is really about, or in this case, what the character is really about. We're never gonna go in the dark room. This is something that's never stated explicitly. We're never actually gonna go there, but through seeing all the other rooms, we can kind of infer what's in the dark room. And the dark room is called the dark room because it is often dark. So I talk a bit about dark room with one of my own characters in an upcoming video that I'm in the process of filming right now. It's a line editing video of me line editing my short story Symbiosis, which you may have read. The story is so old and the writing in it is a little but basically in it I was talking a little bit about the main character Jensen's dark room. I feel weird explicitly stating the dark room of my character because this is like something you're never supposed to say, but basically the dark room for him is that finds it easier to have relationships with people who are dead than people who are alive. So the fact that he collects bones is kind of a window into that. The fact that the one person he's really in love with is probably dead because he has major attachment issues and a dead person can never leave you. I don't mean this in like a necrophilia way. Like, I don't mean that like he has relationships with dead people. I just mean that like he idealizes dead people. That was kind of a dark room in that story. It's like that inner messed up thing that we're never gonna say, but it's kind of coloring everything the character does. The dark room is kind of the thing where like if your character went to therapy, a therapist would have to spend like years unpacking everything your character's been through in order to like figure out what the dark room is. Like, it's that part of them. Before I get into like my last kind of rounding off points of this really long video, I just wanted to share a couple questions that you can ask yourself if you feel like you're struggling to really pin down your character. What makes them different from any other person? A character, especially a narrator, should be someone we've never seen before in life. What makes their outlook on the world different from everyone else's? Again, if we're gonna spend so long wrapped up in their viewpoint, what are we getting from their viewpoint that we can't get from anyone else's? What questions do they ask themselves about the world or about their own lives? How do they see other people and how do they see themselves? So these are things I've kind of briefly talked about in other points. We're gonna talk about flaw. So flaw is obviously something that everyone kind of knows, that interesting characters are flawed. Flaw can find itself rooted in any or all of the things I just talked about. Every single thing I just talked about is a way to explore your character's flaws, and if anything, every single one of those things should be flawed in some way. Flaw isn't really just like a single quality you can throw onto a character and be like, oh, but she's arrogant. Oh, but he's insecure. It's not just like a single thing you can throw onto a character. Flaw is very deeply rooted in a character's worldview and a character's experience and a character's lens and a character's interpretation of events. So basically everything I just told you, every like technique that you can use to look at character, all of those things are ways of constructing a character flaw. And I think it's important to remember that a character flaw is really only useful in the plot if it actually affects the plot. Sorry, awkward is not a good character flaw. Everybody is awkward. If your character is awkward, that just makes them kind of cute. It's really a bad character flaw because it's not making your character different from any other human. It's not really earning them a place as narrator. So when you're thinking of flaw, you can think of primarily like it's in the dark room, but their flaw is rooted in basically every single aspect of their psychology. And then the last thing I wanted to say to round off this video is, when you're creating a character, don't be afraid of the human messiness. I think characters, you know, are people. They may not be real breathing people, but they are kind of real people on the page, and as a writer they probably feel pretty real to you. Don't be afraid of the messiness that is a human being and is a human being's mind. A character can't really be created in a perfectly logical way, because that's not how any human being works. People are messy and their internal worlds are very messy, and don't deprive your character of that. If you feel like your character is missing something, the thing they might be missing is the messiness that makes a person a person. So don't be scared to give them that, because it's going to be what makes them interesting and what makes them do interesting things on the page. I'm gonna wrap up this video now. I'm sorry it was so long, but this is like a huge topic. It's kind of probably one of the biggest topics in writing, but also one that in some ways is kind of hard to teach. So those are just some things you can look at when you're creating characters to create more complex characters. I hope this video was helpful. Thank you guys so much for watching, and if you have any questions, you can send me an ask on Tumblr.